Hello and welcome to a new episode of targz. Today we talk about a paper titled Intrinsic Dimension of Data Representations in Deep Neural Networks. And our guest today is one of the authors of the paper, Alessio and Sweeney. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation.
It's a pleasure, Alessio. Would you like to introduce yourself before we jump into the paper?
Okay, yes. I am a theoretical physicist. I did my studies in University La Sapienza in Rome. At the time, my university was really filled with amazing teachers and professors like Giorgio Parisi, to name one. And I did also my PhD there in, let's say, complex systems, which is, let's say, kind of a relatively new branch of theoretical physics where you try to infer the behavior of a complex systems in terms of the interactions of many simpler parts, but in a way which is try to trespass kind of the reductionist approach in which everything if you know everything in every detail at the macroscopic level, then you're done. It's not like that because the dynamics, the emergent behaviors go much beyond the properties of the elements of a complex system. But then during the PhD studies, I got really intrigued first by biology, by randomly reading books about molecular biology and also neuroscience, and also learning problems, something that didn't relate directly with my PhD, but I was kind of intrigued and trapped in.
So this led you to the study of neural networks then?
Yes, I didn't go very deep inside the team at the time. I studied mostly models of the brain, biologically plausible neural networks model of the brains, but that are very different with respect to the neural networks that we are going to talk about today and is the content of the paper.
So yeah, let's talk about the paper. So can you give us let's say, a high-level
Yeah.
overview of it?
Yes. So in that paper, we analyzed the particular types of models of neural networks that are convolutional neural networks that are inspired from neurobiological studies about how the visual system works. So these networks are composed by kind of a sequence of so-called layers that are basically collections of neurons, artificial neurons, arranged in a particular architecture that for this type of networks try to capture some properties of the visual world. For example, if you are able to recognize a cat in a certain position of an image, this competence is useful also in other parts of the image. So basically, the aim is to take an image, recognize what is inside, and then classify it. For example, if in the image there is a cat, they have to reply cat. If there is a dog, they have to reply dog, and so on and so forth. As I said, the architecture is composed by a sequence of these layers that process the image, try to find patterns in it from the low-level characteristics of the image, like gradients of luminance, colors, very simple aspects of the image, to more sophisticated patterns like textures or small geometric forms like circles, squares, progressively construct a hierarchy of representations that are more and more sophisticated. And then on top of these progressively more complex features, they then can integrate this information at the end, and then at the very end provide a classification. This is the cat maybe because at the beginning I detected the kind of particular shape of the ears and of the nose and the fact that there are also whiskers and so on. Maybe there is a tail. So they are able to progressively integrate all this information. At the end, they are able, integrating all of this, to provide response. These networks are able to extract different aspects of the image And then they are able also to integrate in a unique representation, let's say, towards the end of the architecture that contains a lot of the semantics of the image.
Okay.
And at the same time, they are also, after you train this network by providing examples of correct responses and also false responses, you are able to train this on a large database of images. And at the end, the network is also able to generalize. What I mean by this, if I show you another image, for example, of a cat that hasn't been seen during the process of training, nonetheless, the network is able to provide a correct response on average, because the network was able actually to generalize to unseen data, because it captured basically the logic of the arrangement of all these parts.
So if you, let's say, look at a tiger and a small cat, there will be kind of, still a sort of cat.
Oh, yes, actually, it's something that we explored a little bit later, but when you provide the images, for example, let's take animals, so species that are very related, like tigers and cat, the network realized this. And if you look at its representations inside each layer, you can see that progressively the network recognizes the relationship. But this is something that happens progressively. If you look at the internal processing of the network, progressively these two types of animals, they will become closer. And this relationship of being close is related to the fact that they are evolutionarily similar and also visually similar to a certain extent.
And so, what is the intrinsic dimension of data the paper is kind of talking about?
Okay, so let's talk first about what are representations, because I just mentioned, but I didn't tell you what they are really. Okay, so when an input image arrives in this network, as I said, there is a sequence of layers that process it. Basically, at each layer, there is a collection of neurons that becomes more or less activated. And you can represent this overall activation by a vector, which is typically a vector in a very, very large, with a very, very large number of components. That is the number of the neurons in the layer. And so is a vector in a very, very high dimensional space. And at each layer, you have typically a different number of neurons for these types of networks. So at each layer, you have a different vector in a different space that represents your input data. So your image is converted in a vector, and then in another vector, and then in another vector, and then at the end, you have the response. For example, an image of 1 megapixel will have a dimensionality of 1 million dimensions. You can see this as a vector or a point in a very, very high dimensional space. But actually, it turns out that if you take a large number of these images, and so you have, let's say, n images, you have n vectors in this very, very large space, but they are not spread out all over the possible dimensions. Why? Because actually there are relationships between the different parts of the images. And so it turns out that in this very, very large space of images, the images are not arranged randomly, but will tend to occupy a portion of this space which is relatively small. There is this common accepted hypothesis in all this field, which is called the manifold hypothesis, that tells you that interesting data set, when you represent these in this way as vectors in a very large space, will tend to stay close to a surface that has a lower dimensionality. We call it a manifold, but it's not actually very important to have a rigorous definition here. And we call this dimensionality of this surface the intrinsic dimensionality of the data. So what we did is to monitor, first of all, the intrinsic dimensionality of the data in the normal space. Example, for images, it will be in pixel space, but also when the image goes through all these processing steps in a network, how this intrinsic dimensionality evolves. Why we want to know that? Because imagine that you have a network that has been trained and it is a very good network. Then you want to know how this network solve your problem. So you want to interpret its operations because you want to know what are the inner algorithms, let's say with quotes, that the networks implement to solve the problem. And this is very difficult to do in general. It's very, very difficult to reverse engineer what a neural network is doing, also when it's correctly solving a problem, because actually it's composed of many units and there is no clear understanding of what neural networks are doing to solve a problem. And there is a whole field which is called neural network interpretability that deals with this problem and monitoring the intrinsic dimensionality of the data representations in all the steps from the input to the solution kind of constraints possible theories about neural networks, what neural networks are doing to solve the problem.
Just to summarize quickly, mostly for my own understanding, the point is that the moment you, let's say, unroll this image into vectors, you have a lot of, let's say, you have a huge vector with a lot of dimensions, but you are really interested in knowing the one that are the intrinsic dimensions, so the minimum number that can help you represent the image layer by layer to reduce a bit the complexity. So you go through all the layers, monitoring what is the intrinsic dimension value, so what are the minimum number of dimension, and in this way you proceed to get more explainability of what the actual neural network is doing.
Yes, exactly. This dimensionality is maybe the simplest and more natural thing to observe at the beginning when you want to figure out what the network is doing. Because actually, yes, it's very rooted in this manifold hypothesis that tells you that the data, since they have a structure, they have correlations, complicated correlations, the data are not spread all over the place, but they concentrate themselves on these low dimensional surfaces. And you want to see how the network is manipulating this manifold across the layers in order to arrive at the end of a very, very simple manifold from which you can basically linearly read out, in this case, the categories of the images, the classes.
Okay, cool.
Because
So,
I can make an
yeah,
example, maybe.
sure. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe to tell you why at the beginning in the input space, the manifold can be so complicated and the classes very entangled between themselves. I don't know if it happened to you that you see a person from a particular angle. This person is very, very similar to a friend of yours, and you recognize him as your friend, but then the person just move a little bit, just a tiny angle, and then you realize, no, it's not him, it's another person. These two images are very, very similar because just a very, very small angle of difference, but the class is very different. So this is just to tell you that in this input space, the pixel space, sometimes you have very similar images that represent very different classes. And also sometimes you have very, very unsimilar images, like the same image translated by one pixel that is representing the same thing. So it's a very, very complicated surface that the network learns how to disentangle progressively in order to solve this complicated problem.
And so, what results did you achieve?
we found the first result is analyzing different types of networks, like, for example, residual networks as opposed to classical convolutional networks like VGG of different sizes too. We found a common trend. We found that in the early layers of these convolutional networks, this intrinsic dimensionality is expanded. You can see a marked peak of the intrinsic dimension in the first 1/3 of the architectures. And basically, it is like the network found by herself just by trying to solve the classification task that is very useful to first project this manifold of the data in a different manifold whose dimensionality is larger. We conjecture that the network learns to do this because when you have more dimensions for your data, it is easier than to separate it into different classes.
So it's like when you have, for example, two objects that are kind of, you see them on a, let's say, 2D space, they are overlapped. And then you move to a 3D space, you can see that they are actually separated, even if you didn't see it in the first place, because there was only kind of 2 dimensions. It is more or less the same principle.
Perfect. I think you really nailed it. Yes, it is exactly something like this. But the striking thing is that we didn't tell the network, of course, how to do that. And the network kind of discovered this independently.
Okay, cool. And so it moved towards more intrinsic dimensions, right? But
yes, it expands
okay.
temporarily. It
Okay.
expands in the first phase, the intrinsic dimensionality. And then after this expansion phase, there is a contraction phase of the intrinsic dimensionality. And it's important to notice when you arrive at the last hidden layer of the classifier, the dimensionality is compressed so much that is lower than the intrinsic dimensionality of the data.
What were your conclusions after obtaining these kind of results?
One very important thing that we noticed is that if you look at the intrinsic dimensionality in the last hidden layer, you find that this intrinsic dimensionality is related to the performance in the recognition of the network. So the ability to compress the network is also a proxy to the performance, which is a very important thing to notice. But maybe the most important thing was that across different architectures and sizes, the computational strategy of these networks to solve the problem of recognition was very similar qualitatively because they all share the same two phases behavior, like this first expansion of the intrinsic dimensionality followed by a progressive compression of the intrinsic dimensionality. And actually, this is one of the reasons why this paper then had a large impact on research.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. And so talking about the impact of the paper, so the paper is from few years now. It's from 2019, right?
Mm-hmm.
What has been kind of the evolution of it?
Actually, before we started this study, when I was in the International School of Advanced Studies in Trieste, we deepened these findings by analyzing other types of behaviors across the different layers. And we also monitored the evolution of the probability density of the data on these manifolds. So now that we knew that these manifolds change their dimensionality according to this empirical law, we also wondered, well, we know that at the end these data are clustered because the network is able to classify things. And so cats, even if in input space different images of cats can be hugely different, but at the end they will become very close together, no? Because the answer will be always cat. The probability distribution of the data changes across the layers. We had at our
Okay.
disposal very powerful algorithms developed by a collaborator of us, Alessio and his group, to reconstruct the probability distribution, how it evolves across layers, and when the different classes start to nucleate, when the different clusters form across the layers, and so on and so forth. And so we also monitored this evolution of the probability distribution, and also we monitored the neighborhood relationships of the data. For example, if I take a data point that represents an image of a cat, and then I look at my neighbors, so the points in the space which are closest, what are the classes of these points? So we find if you are in the input space, typically everything is very, very well mixed, because as I say, the manifold is so complex, so entangled, that the neighbors of one image can be an image of a very different class. But if you go inside the different layers, at a certain point, similar data points semantically, so belonging to the similar class, start to quite quickly nucleate and become together. We also were able to reconstruct, by looking at the distances between the data, the hierarchical structure of the probability distribution. For example, you can reconstruct the phylogenetic tree of the objects, and in particular of the animals that are in your data. So you can see, for example, tigers and cats become similar, but cats are more similar between them than tigers and cats, and so on and so forth. You can derive really phylogenetic trees. Then we used also these insights to analyze more complicated type of networks, which are transformer-based networks, in several domains. For example, in domains like sequence processing. And in order to be concrete, we analyze the proteins. Proteins can be described as sequences of these molecules called amino acids. And so we leverage this type of models for sequences like proteins, but also for images. And we repeated a kind of similar analysis in these domains and found a more articulated evolution, first of all, of the intrinsic dimension profile, that in this case have not one, but two peaks. We suspect that the first peak has a similar role to what we find in convolutional networks. So we found the first expansion of the intrinsic dimensionality, followed by a compression, and a region just in the middle of the model in which the model is able to compress all the information in a very, very low dimensional format, and then followed by another phase in which there is an expansion again of the data, because typically one must remember that these type of models are models that reconstruct the data. They're transformers that have been trained not just with the purpose of classifying, in which you can discard some irrelevant data, but in order to reconstruct, basically, to construct a model of the data complete. And so in this case, from this very, very compressed format, then you have a final phase of expansion, because you have now to go from this compressed format now again back to the input space.
Okay.
And we found also that there are some specific layers from which if you extract representation from these layers, you have very, very semantically rich representations that can be used for downstream tasks. For example, in the case of proteins, sometimes you can find very, very different sequences, but related from common evolutionary history. So proteins that plays more or less the same function in very, very different organisms related by ancient evolutionary history, but they are very, very different on the surface, on the composition in amino acid. Sometimes this type of proteins are brought together in representations in specific layers of these networks. So it means that the network is able to grasp the meaning, the true meaning of these sequences.
Cool. Yeah, very, very fascinating.
This methodology then stemmed, and then a large number of new research, including this and others that we made in the following years, more concentrating ourselves in large language models. And this intrinsic dimension remained useful also to mark different behaviors across the network and also in different conditions. For example, suppose that I have a large language model that is trained to do question answering problems. In this case, I have a question. I ask this question to a large language model. And then I have a certain limited number of possible answers, and the model has to select what is the answer. So I can solve these problems basically in two ways. One way is that I provide a little bit of data on questions and correct answers, and I train a little bit more my pre-trained model on this specific task, and then I test it, and then measure the performance. In this way, I am changing a little bit the weights, the parameters of the model, because I'm doing this fine-tuning procedure. Yeah. I modify my model. But there is also another alternative way that, if you do it carefully, gives you more or less the same performance. And you just provide in the prompt some examples of questions and answers. Let's say 3, 4, 5 examples. And then in the same prompt, you do your question, and you provide the possible answers, and then the network has to guess what is the correct answer. This second version of solving the same problem is called in-context learning. And then what is interesting at this point, well, if I have two different ways of solving the same problem, then how does it solve this problem in the two cases? We found striking differences with all these tools like intrinsic dimension and how the neighborhoods change and how to reconstruct the probability distribution of the representations. And so we were able to characterize the different styles used by the network to solve the same problem in two ways. This was one of the papers that we published last year with our group in Area Science Park.
Alessio, I thank you very much for this explanation. It was super, super interesting. And yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much to you. It was very nice to meeting you and then also to do this chat.
Yeah, thank you again. And thank you for listening. If you like the content, please hit follow on the podcast in whatever platform you are listening to the podcast with, and give us a good review if you like it. Thank you again, and see you at the next episode.